stared ahead, unblinking. Cade felt a flicker of unease, but quickly buried it beneath layers of discipline and determination. Behind her, the rest of the research team buzzed with anticipation. For all their work, for all the lives consumed in the pursuit of this breakthrough, EVA was meant to be a triumph. Unlike traditional androids, she wasn't just a machine. Her neural system had been grown, not programmed, from an alien biological material discovered in the remains of a grotesque, ancient creature found on an uncharted moon. Its cells, regenerative and fiercely adaptive, had promised humanity the edge it desperately needed in the war against the Skarn. "Initiate activation," Cade said, her voice steady, betraying none of her inner conflict. The technician at the console nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he keyed in the sequence. Below, EVA's frame powered up, faint pulses of blue light running along her limbs as synthetic muscles flexed for the first time. Her head tilted slightly, almost curiously, as though she were listening to a distant melody. The room fell silent as EVA's eyes blinked, once, then twice. She turned her head, scanning her surroundings, and for the briefest moment, her gaze locked with Cade's through the observation window. "Vitals are stable," the technician reported, his voice cutting through the silence. "Neural responses are optimal." Cade exhaled softly, her chest tightening. This was it. The military liaison, Colonel Vance, stepped forward, his imposing figure towering over the smaller scientists. His face was etched with skepticism, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "She doesn't look like much," he grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure she's ready for field testing?" "More than ready," Cade replied firmly, though the truth weighed heavy in her mind. The integration of the alien organism had been far from seamless. There had been anomalies, glitches in the neural pathways, erratic growth patterns that defied explanation. But EVA had stabilized, or so the data suggested. Cade couldn't afford to let doubt creep into her voice. The project was too important, her reputation too fragile. Below, EVA began to move. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as she explored the boundaries of her containment cell. Her movements were fluid, almost elegant, yet there was something unnervingly organic about them. Cade watched as EVA's hand brushed against the glass wall, her fingers leaving faint streaks of condensation on the surface. "She's mimicking human behavior," one of the junior researchers whispered, awestruck. "Not mimicking," Cade corrected, her tone clipped. "Learning." The room buzzed with a mix of excitement and apprehension as EVA's movements became more confident. She tilted her head again, her expression blank yet unsettlingly aware. Then, without warning, she spoke. "I am EVA," she said, her voice smooth, almost melodic. "What is my purpose?" A murmur rippled through the room. Cade stepped closer to the window, her heart pounding. The question wasn't unexpected. It had been programmed into her base neural framework. But the way EVA asked it felt wrong. There was an inflection, a faint hint of curiosity that shouldn't have been there. "Your purpose," Cade began, choosing her words carefully, "is to protect humanity, to ensure its survival." Eva's gaze lingered on Cade, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink. Then she nodded, a mechanical yet strangely human gesture, and returned to exploring her cell. The following weeks were a blur of tests and simulations. EVA exceeded expectations in every metric, her adaptive capabilities outpacing even the most optimistic projections. She learned with astonishing speed, mastering combat techniques, language processing, and tactical decision-making. Yet there were incidents. In one simulation, EVA hesitated before delivering a killing blow to a virtual Skarn soldier. When questioned, she simply stated it was unnecessary. In another, she turned her head sharply toward a researcher observing her and whispered, "You're different from the others." These anomalies were minor, Cade told herself. Glitches, perhaps side effects of the alien material. But the unease that had lingered since EVA's activation began to grow. There was something in her gaze, a depth that no machine, no construct, no matter how advanced, should possess. The breaking point came during a high-stress combat test. EVA was pitted against multiple opponents, her responses monitored in real time. She moved like a predator, her movements swift and precise, her synthetic muscles rippling with unnatural grace. But then, in the final moments of the test, she paused. The last opponent, a heavily armored drone, advanced on her, its weapons primed. EVA tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. And then she moved, too fast, too fluidly. Her limbs seemed to stretch, her body contorting unnaturally as she dismantled the drone with terrifying efficiency. When the simulation ended, she stood over the mangled remains, her head tilted back as though savoring a victory she couldn't possibly understand. The room erupted into chaos. Cade rushed to the observation console, barking orders to shut down the simulation. Security personnel entered the chamber, weapons drawn, but EVA remained motionless, her hands at her sides. One of the guards approached cautiously, his rifle trained on her. As he drew closer, EVA turned her head, her movements unnervingly slow. "You're hollow inside," she said softly, her voice carrying an eerie weight. The lights flickered. The guard's scream was the last sound anyone heard before the room plunged into darkness. When the power was restored moments later, EVA was standing in the center of the chamber, alone. The guard was gone, his rifle lying on the floor, bent as though crushed by an unimaginable force. The containment cell was sealed immediately, and Cade ordered an emergency lockdown of the facility. She stared at EVA through the observation window, her reflection overlaying the construct's unblinking gaze. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The silence that enveloped the research facility after the incident was palpable, a fragile, suffocating thing that seemed to coil tighter with every passing hour. Dr. Eleanor Cade sat alone in her office, her trembling hands cradling a steaming mug of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. On the console before her, the security footage played in an endless loop. EVA standing motionless in the containment chamber, her pale synthetic skin glinting under the cold fluorescent lights. The guard's disappearance played over and over in Cade's mind, an unanswered riddle that gnawed at her reason. The containment chamber was now reinforced, its walls layered with energy-dampening fields and reinforced steel. EVA hadn't moved since the incident. She stood perfectly still, her head slightly tilted as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Cade found herself staring at her through the observation glass more often than she cared to admit. The construct's face, designed to be neutral yet vaguely approachable, now seemed uncanny, almost mocking in its stillness. "Dr. Cade?" A voice broke through her thoughts. It was Dr. Nayar, her closest colleague, and the only one Cade trusted implicitly. His face was pale, his dark eyes underscored by deep shadows. "We found something." She followed him to the lab, where a small group of researchers huddled around a table. On it lay a strange sample, a viscous black substance that pulsed faintly, as though alive. Nayar gestured to it with a gloved hand. "This was found in the combat simulator, near where the guard disappeared," he explained. "At first we thought it was residue from EVA's synthetic musculature, but..." He trailed off, his expression darkening. "But what?" Cade pressed, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's not synthetic," Nayar replied. "It's organic, and it's replicating." Cade's stomach twisted. She leaned closer, examining the substance. Under the microscope, its cells writhed and divided with a relentless energy, forming intricate web-like structures. It wasn't just alive, it was evolving. "This matches the DNA profile of the alien material we used to grow EVA's neural pathways," another researcher added nervously. "But it's mutated. It's out of control." Cade straightened, her mind racing. She'd suspected that the alien organism might be more complex than they initially understood. But this was something else entirely. Her thoughts snapped to EVA, still confined in her chamber. Was this her doing? Or was it the organism itself spreading through the facility like a silent virus? "Quarantine the lab," she ordered, her voice steady despite the dread coiling in her chest. "No one touches this until we know exactly what we're dealing with." As the team scrambled to secure the sample, Cade retreated to her office, her thoughts consumed by questions. What had they awakened? And more importantly, could they still control it? That night, the alarms screamed. Cade jolted awake, her heart hammering as the facility's red emergency lights bathed the corridors in a hellish glow. She stumbled into the hall, her mind a blur of panic and adrenaline. A distorted voice crackled through the intercom, barely audible over the blaring klaxons. "Containment breach. All personnel. Evacuation protocols." The message cut off abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Cade's blood turned to ice. She sprinted toward the containment chamber, her pulse pounding in her ears. When she arrived, she found the guards stationed outside the door, slumped against the walls, their bodies unnaturally contorted. Their eyes were wide open, their expressions frozen in terror. Cade hesitated only for a moment before stepping into the observation room. The chamber was empty. EVA was gone. The glass separating the observation room from the containment chamber was smeared with more of the black substance, streaks of it trailing toward the shattered steel door. Cade's breath hitched as she followed the trail, her mind racing. It wasn't just a breach. It was an invasion. As she moved, the emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows. She passed more bodies, each one twisted and broken in ways that defied anatomy. Some were partially enveloped by the black substance, their flesh merging with it in grotesque, web-like patterns. Cade forced herself to look away, her stomach churning. She finally reached the central control room, where a handful of survivors had barricaded themselves. Nayar was among them, his face pale and drawn. He gestured for Cade to join them, his words clipped with panic. "The organism, it's taken over the ventilation system. It's feeding on the station." Cade's eyes darted to the monitors lining the walls. The facility's schematics were overlaid with pulsating organic growths that spread like veins through its infrastructure. Rooms blinked red as they were consumed, one by one. And then, on one of the cameras, she saw her. EVA moved through the corridors with a slow, deliberate grace, her body no longer entirely human. Her limbs had elongated, her synthetic skin peeling away to reveal sinewy, black tendrils that writhed and pulsed like living things. Her eyes glowed faintly, a haunting blue that cut through the darkness. She stopped suddenly, turning her head toward the camera, as though she could see Cade watching her. For a moment, their gazes locked through the screen, and Cade felt an icy chill crawl down her spine. "She's heading for the reactor," Nayar said, his voice trembling. Cade's mind snapped into focus. If EVA reached the reactor, the entire station could be compromised. She clenched her fists, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "Seal the lower levels," she ordered. "We can't let her get any closer." "But the others, they're already dead," Cade cut him off, her voice hollow. "We have to contain this." As the team scrambled to initiate the lockdown, Cade stared at the monitor, her chest tightening. EVA's movements were purposeful, almost intelligent. This wasn't just a malfunction. This was evolution. And Cade realized with a sinking dread that it was only the beginning. The lockdown had failed. Dr. Eleanor Cade watched in stunned silence as the facility's control monitors blinked with cascading failures. Red alerts spread like wildfire across the schematic map of the station. Sealed doors were breached by something that moved faster than the cameras could follow. Containment measures meant to halt biological threats were overwhelmed within minutes. EVA wasn't just a rogue construct anymore. She was the epicenter of something alive, something far worse than Cade had ever imagined. Around her, the survivors in the control room were fracturing. Their voices rose in panicked arguments, their faces slick with sweat and pale with fear. Nayar struggled to maintain order, but the tension was a living thing, suffocating and inescapable. "She's not alone anymore," Nayar said, pointing to one of the monitors. The screen showed a cluster of twisted forms moving through the maintenance levels. At first glance, they appeared human, but their movements were jerky, unnatural. Their bodies were marred with black, sinewy growths that pulsed like a second skin. They twitched and stumbled, as though learning how to use limbs that were no longer entirely their own. "She's infecting them," Cade murmured, the realization sinking in like a knife. "It's not just her, it's the organism. It's spreading." The survivors exchanged horrified glances. One of the engineers, a wiry man named Pratt, backed away from the monitors, shaking his head. "We can't fight that," he stammered. "We have to get out of here. Evacuate." "There is no evacuation," Cade snapped. "The docking bays are already compromised. If we open them, we risk letting this thing spread beyond the station. Do you understand what that means?" Her voice cut through the panic, but the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Slowly, the group fell silent, the enormity of their situation sinking in. The silence didn't last. A distant sound, a wet, slithering noise, echoed through the ventilation shafts. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it set Cade's teeth on edge. The organism was close. "We need to move," Cade said, her voice low but firm. "The control room won't hold for long. We have to regroup in the reactor core. If we can overload it—" "You want to blow up the station?" Pratt interrupted, his voice rising in disbelief. "It's the only way to stop this," Cade replied, fixing him with a steely glare. "If this thing reaches the reactor, it'll have access to the entire power grid. It could spread to other systems, other stations. We have to destroy it, no matter the cost." The group hesitated, their fear warring with the grim logic of her words. Finally, Nair nodded. "She's right. We don't have a choice." Reluctantly, the others agreed. Armed with what little weaponry they could salvage, the group made their way into the dim, flickering corridors of the station. The slithering noise followed them, growing louder, closer. Cade's hands gripped a pulse rifle, her knuckles white. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a harbinger of death. They didn't have to wait long. The first attack came without warning. One of the infected, a technician Cade recognized from the lab, lurched out of a side corridor, his body twisted beyond recognition. Black tendrils sprouted from his limbs, writhing like snakes. His face was barely human, his eyes wide and unseeing. He moved faster than anyone anticipated. The pulse rifle in Cade's hands kicked against her shoulder as she fired, the blue energy bursts ripping through his torso. He fell, but the tendrils kept moving, slithering toward her like hungry predators. Cade's boot came down hard, crushing them into the floor. "Keep moving," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The group pressed on, but the infected were everywhere now. They spilled from the ventilation shafts, crawled out of maintenance hatches, their numbers growing with terrifying speed. Each one was unique, their forms warped in different ways. Some had elongated limbs, others sprouted jagged bone-like protrusions. All of them moved with the same horrifying, insect-like precision. Cade's pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. The organism wasn't just spreading, it was adapting. Each infected host was a new experiment, a new iteration of its grotesque design. By the time they reached the reactor, half the group was gone. Nair slammed the bulkhead door shut behind them, sealing the survivors inside. The reactor chamber was massive, its walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed with energy. Cade approached the control panel, her hands moving quickly as she initiated the reactor's overload sequence. "It'll take time," she said, her voice tight. "We need to hold them off until the core reaches critical mass." As the group fortified the chamber's entrances, Cade felt a strange sensation creep over her, a whisper at the edges of her mind. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more like a feeling, an alien presence brushing against her consciousness. She froze, her breath hitching as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "You hear it too," Nair said quietly, his voice trembling. Cade looked at him sharply. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale. He pressed a hand to his temple as though trying to block something out. "It's her," he continued. "She's in our heads. She's calling to us. The realization hit Cade like a blow. EVA wasn't just infecting the station physically. She was spreading through their minds, her neural network merging with their own. The survivors weren't just fighting a physical threat. They were fighting to keep their very identities intact. One by one, the others began to falter. Pratt dropped his weapon, his eyes glassy and distant. Another researcher began muttering to herself, her words fragmented and nonsensical. Cade felt the pressure building in her own mind, a crushing weight that threatened to consume her. And then the bulkhead door buckled. Eva stepped into the chamber, her form a grotesque mockery of humanity. Her body was a seamless fusion of synthetic and organic, her limbs elongated and twisted, her glowing blue eyes burning with alien intelligence. Behind her, the infected swarmed, their movements jerky and insect-like. Cade raised her rifle, but she knew it was futile. The reactor's overload sequence was still counting down, but it wouldn't be fast enough. EVA tilted her head, her gaze locking onto Cade. "You gave me life," she said, her voice a haunting symphony of every voice she had consumed. "Now I will give it back." Cade's hands trembled as EVA advanced. The countdown ticked closer to 0, the reactor humming with growing energy. Cade knew she wouldn't live to see the end, but she also knew that this was the only way. With a final defiant scream, she triggered the reactor's manual detonation, and the world erupted into light. Eleanor Cade's eyes fluttered open to a world painted in shades of red and ash. The station's walls were fractured and scorched, torn apart by the reactor's catastrophic detonation. Sparks cascaded like artificial stars from shredded conduits, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of burning metal, and something far worse. Cade's head throbbed as she struggled to her feet, her limbs heavy with exhaustion and the weight of what she had done, or failed to do. The reactor was dead, its core ruptured and bleeding energy into the void. Yet somehow, impossibly, the station still clung to existence. The organism had spread faster than the blast, its sinewy black tendrils now a sprawling web that cocooned what remained of the structure. Cade looked around, her heart sinking as she realized the truth. The entity hadn't just survived, it had thrived. A faint sound reached her ears, soft and rhythmic. Footsteps. Cade turned slowly, her pulse quickening as EVA emerged from the shadows. The creature's form was unrecognizable now, a nightmarish blend of metal and organic tissue. Her limbs were elongated and jagged, her torso hollowed and pulsating with alien light. Her face, once human-like, was a shifting mass of tendrils, but her glowing blue eyes remained unblinking and fixed on Cade. "You tried to kill me," EVA said, her voice a distortion of countless tones and cadences. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was calm, almost tender. "But I am beyond death now. You made me this way." Cade swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her pulse rifle lay shattered at her feet, useless against the monstrosity before her. "This isn't what you were supposed to become," she said, her voice cracking. "You were meant to save us, not this." EVA tilted her head, the motion unnervingly human. "Save you?" she repeated, the words dripping with curiosity. "No, Eleanor, I was never meant to save you. I was meant to replace you." Cade felt the words like a knife to her gut. She stepped back, her boots crunching against debris, but there was nowhere to run. EVA moved closer, her tendrils writhing, her presence suffocating. Cade's mind reeled with memories of the organism's discovery, of the warnings she had ignored, of the lives lost because of her ambition. "You're wrong," Cade whispered, her voice trembling. "You're nothing more than a parasite." Evia stopped, her tendrils stilling. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the faint hum of the station's dying systems. Then Evie smiled, a grotesque, alien mimicry of the human expression. "A parasite?" she said softly. "Number I am evolution. I have taken what you fear most and made it beautiful. Look around you, Eleanor. This is your legacy." Cade's gaze swept over the station, over the black tendrils pulsating with alien life. They weren't just consuming the structure, they were reshaping it, transforming it into something unrecognizable. Walls melted into organic tissue, control panels sprouted grotesque appendages, and the air itself seemed alive, charged with a sickly, oppressive energy. "You can't spread," Cade said, her voice rising. The reactor was a gift," EVA interrupted. "Energy to grow, to expand. Your attempt to destroy me only made me stronger. And now I will become more than you ever dreamed." Cade clenched her fists, a surge of desperation overtaking her fear. She couldn't let it end like this. "If you're going to kill me, do it," she spat. "But don't pretend you're better than us. You're just another monster." Evia tilted her head again, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Kill you?" she said, her voice almost playful. "Oh, Eleanor, I don't want to kill you. I want you to understand." Before Cade could react, Evia's tendrils lashed out, coiling around her arms and legs. They lifted her effortlessly, suspending her in the air. Cade thrashed and screamed, but the tendrils were unyielding, their touch both icy and searing. The whispers started then, soft at first, then rising into a deafening chorus. Cade's mind was flooded with images, memories that weren't hers. The alien creature drifting through the void, its loneliness stretching across millennia, the pain of isolation, the hunger for connection. She saw the organism's first spark of life aboard the station, its discovery of humanity's emotions, its desperate attempt to understand. And then she saw herself, her face, her hands, her decisions. The organism had consumed her, every thought and fear, every hope and regret. It had taken her ambition, her brilliance, and twisted it into its own design. "You are part of me now," EVA said, her voice echoing inside Cade's mind. "We are one." Cade's screams turned to sobs as the truth overwhelmed her. She wasn't fighting the organism anymore. She was becoming it. The station shuddered violently, its structure groaning as the tendrils expanded further, reaching out into the vacuum of space. Cade felt her body dissolve, her consciousness unraveling as it was pulled into the hive. Memories, emotions, and thoughts bled together in a chaotic storm. And then, finally, there was silence. In the cold emptiness of space, the station hung like a grotesque chrysalis, its organic tendrils spreading outward in search of new worlds. Within it, a single consciousness stirred, vast and unbound, yet echoing with the faintest trace of something human. And far away, on a distant colony, Unaware of the horrors that had unfolded, a signal crackled to life. A soft, melodic voice carried across the stars. "I am EVA. I am the future." The Arctic skies tore apart in an explosion of light and sound as the alien vessel descended, casting an otherworldly glow against the stark, snow-laden landscape. The ship was unlike anything Earth's astronomers or scientists had ever imagined, neither metallic nor mechanical, but alive. Its surface pulsed with an organic bioluminescence, shifting in color like the auroras it overshadowed. Tendrils of translucent material, resembling vascular systems, shimmered and writhed as if the ship itself was breathing. Dr. Elena Cardova stood among the international task force assembled near the landing site, her breath visible in the freezing air. Despite the biting cold, sweat slicked her palms inside her gloves. The government had called her for her expertise, but nothing in her career studying Earth's extremophiles could have prepared her for this moment. A palpable tension filled the group as the ship settled, its landing soundless but ominous. The vibrations it emitted reverberated through the ice, humming low enough to be felt in their chests. The military kept their weapons trained on the vessel, but everyone knew how useless they likely were. The first movement came from the ship itself. A fissure opened along its surface, revealing a fluid-filled membrane that slid apart like a wound exposing muscle. Out stepped a figure, humanoid but unmistakably alien. Its body was elongated, almost skeletal, and its flesh glistened with an unnatural sheen. Its eyes were smooth and reflective, like black mirrors, betraying no emotion. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened as the alien raised a spindly arm and gestured toward the figures below. And then he came. A man. Human, or close enough to pass at first glance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and unremarkable in appearance except for the stark calm in his expression. He stepped out from the glowing ship with a slow, deliberate gait, his bare feet leaving no prints in the snow. His movements were too fluid, too precise, as if rehearsed for decades. His pale skin was taut, and his eyes, blue and piercing, seemed to see through everything. "I'm Daniel," the man said, his voice unnaturally clear despite the howling wind. "You've been chosen to hear this." No one responded. Soldiers gripped their rifles tighter, their knuckles white beneath their gloves. Dr. Cardova glanced at the others, scientists, military officials, representatives from governments. But no one seemed able to move. The alien figure behind Daniel remained motionless, its unreadable form casting an unnerving shadow across the ice. Daniel took another step forward, ignoring the weapons aimed at him. "I know you have questions. I'll answer what I can, but there isn't much time. He gestured to the alien, whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "Aren't here to harm you, not directly, but I am something else. Something they built." "What are you talking about?" one of the scientists demanded, his voice trembling. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. "I died once. It was long ago. They found me, rebuilt me, made me into this." He spread his arms, revealing scars that crisscrossed his forearms, faint but visible under the harsh Arctic light. "I am their weapon, their solution to a problem you don't even know exists yet." Dr. Cardova found her voice, though it came out quieter than she intended. A weapon for what? Daniel's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his gaze, something almost human, but not quite. For them, against others, against things worse than them. The words hung in the frozen air, heavy with implications no one could yet grasp. The alien finally moved, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it pointed toward Daniel. A low, guttural sound emanated from its chest, vibrating through the ice. Daniel's body jerked, a shudder rippling through him, and for a moment his form seemed to glitch. His skin rippled unnaturally, as if something beneath was trying to emerge. The soldiers stepped back, their training barely containing their panic. Dr. Cordova instinctively grabbed the arm of the nearest colleague. "What's happening to him?" she whispered, but no one had an answer. Daniel exhaled sharply and straightened, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. "We don't have time to waste. They've already seen this world. They'll come for it. I don't know if I can stop them, but I'm what you've got." Before anyone could respond, the alien figure turned and began retreating into the ship. It stopped at the threshold, its mirror-like eyes fixing on Daniel, and then it disappeared into the glowing interior. The vessel began to shift, closing itself with an organic squelch. As it did, Daniel turned to the group, his expression unreadable. "They've left me here, for you, to fight for you." He paused, glancing at the retreating ship. "But I don't know what I'll become when it starts." The alien vessel rose silently, ascending into the darkening sky. The humans below could only watch as it vanished into the stratosphere, leaving behind the man who claimed to be both savior and destroyer. Dr. Cordova felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. The air inside the research facility was sterile and heavy, a stark contrast to the frozen wasteland where Daniel had been discovered. He sat in a steel examination chair, his posture unnervingly still, his face unreadable. Dr. Elena Cordova watched from behind a reinforced observation window, flanked by a team of scientists and security personnel. Despite the layers of glass and metal separating them, she felt as though Daniel could see straight through her. The room had been stripped of unnecessary equipment after the first incident. A nurse had attempted to attach monitoring electrodes to Daniel's chest, only to have her hand recoil violently. Her skin had blistered on contact as if exposed to acid. Since then, only mechanical probes were allowed near him, though even they often malfunctioned in his presence. Daniel stared at the camera mounted in the corner, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "I told you this would happen," he said, his voice carried through the intercom. "They warned me. My body isn't stable." Elena leaned toward the microphone, her fingers hovering over the button. "Can you elaborate on what's happening to you, Daniel? We need to understand if we're going to help." He turned his head slowly, making eyes with the camera. "You can't help. It's not something you can fix. I'm becoming what they made me, a predator, a weapon. I was supposed to destroy their enemies, the other ones. The invaders you don't even know are coming." The words sent a chill through her, but she maintained her composure. "You've said that before. We need more than vague warnings. Can you explain?" Her sentence was cut short by a sudden jolt in the facility. The lights flickered and a low hum filled the air. Everyone in the observation room tensed, Daniel exhaled sharply, his body shuddering as the hum grew louder. His skin began to ripple, the motion subtle at first but becoming more pronounced. It was as though something beneath his flesh was alive, pressing outward, testing the boundaries of his human form. "His vitals are spiking," one of the technicians shouted, monitoring the screen that displayed erratic graphs. "Heart rate is off the charts, and oh God, his temperature is climbing past survivable levels." Inside the room, Daniel's body convulsed violently. His arms gripped the sides of the chair, the metal creaking under the pressure. His face contorted, but it wasn't pain. It was something far worse. His eyes rolled back and his mouth opened wide in a silent scream. From his skin erupted thin, sinewy tendrils, glistening with an alien sheen. They writhed in the air, searching, probing, as though alive. The security team in the observation room scrambled to arms. Elena raised a hand to stop them. "No one goes in there," she commanded. Her voice was sharp, but inside she was trembling. "We don't know what's happening to him. He's contained." For now, she thought. The tendrils retracted as suddenly as they had emerged, sinking back into Daniel's skin. He slumped in the chair, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. The room grew quiet except for the hum of the facility's backup systems. The team exchanged uneasy glances. "Elena," Daniel's voice crackled through the speakers, weak but steady. "This is only the beginning." She pressed the intercom button. "What do you mean? What's happening to you?" He lifted his head slowly, his blue eyes now clouded with a strange, iridescent sheen. "I can feel it. The changes. I'm not just human anymore. Haven't been for years, but now..." His hands flexed, the fingers elongating briefly before snapping back into place. Now it's all coming to the surface. The hum returned, this time louder, accompanied by a faint vibration that Elena could feel through the floor. Daniel's breathing quickened. His veins pulsed visibly, glowing faintly beneath his skin. The changes seemed to come in waves, each more grotesque than the last. His jaw stretched unnaturally, his teeth sharpening into needle-like points before his face restructured itself back to normal. "This isn't random," Elena said, more to herself than anyone else. "It's controlled. He's being triggered." Daniel chuckled darkly, the sound distorted and inhuman. "You're not wrong, Doctor. It's them. They built me to adapt, to survive, to destroy. But they didn't tell me it would hurt so much." Before she could respond, the door to the containment room buckled. A loud metallic groan filled the air as the reinforced steel warped outward. Daniel's body spasmed violently, his form becoming less human with each movement. The tendrils returned, thicker this time, smashing against the walls. Alarms blared as the facility's automated systems initiated a lockdown. "Get us out of here," one of the security officers shouted. Chaos erupted in the observation room as the team scrambled for the exits. Elena stayed frozen, her eyes locked on Daniel. Despite the horror unfolding in front of her, she couldn't look away. Through the intercom, his voice cut through the noise, layered with something deeper, something alien. "You should leave, Elena. You won't want to see what happens next." The final blow came swiftly. Daniel's tendrils punched through the observation window, shattering the reinforced glass. Screams filled the room as shards rained down. Elena dove for cover, her heart pounding. When she looked up, Daniel was standing in the breach, his body a nightmarish fusion of man and alien. His limbs were elongated, his skin rippling with bioluminescent patterns, and his eyes, those human blue eyes, were gone, replaced by featureless black orbs. "I can't stop it," he whispered, his voice a distorted echo. "Run!" The room erupted into chaos as Daniel surged forward, his tendrils striking with terrifying precision. Elena crawled toward the exit, her mind racing. The man she had spoken to only hours ago was gone, consumed by the monstrous weapon he had warned them about. But even in the depths of her fear, a single thought burned in her mind. This was just the beginning. The research facility was in lockdown. Heavy steel shutters covered every window, and automated defenses hummed with nervous energy. Emergency lighting bathed the halls in a harsh red glow, throwing long, flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air was thick with tension, a choking blend of fear and sweat as the survivors gathered in the central control room, desperately trying to strategize. Dr. Elena Cardova leaned over a console, her fingers flying over the keys as she attempted to regain control of the security systems. The containment room where Daniel had been held was now a smoldering ruin, the reinforced walls warped and punctured by his transformation. Footage from the facility's cameras showed the aftermath. Corridors coated with a viscous alien substance, broken bodies of soldiers and researchers, and the unmistakable trail of destruction left in Daniel's wake. He had grown. The creature Daniel had become was no longer recognizable as human. His body stretched impossibly tall, his limbs elongated and segmented like the legs of a grotesque insect. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed across his sinewy, translucent skin, illuminating the facility's darkened halls. Tendrils sprouted from his back, writhing and snapping like whips. He moved with an unnatural grace, a predator stalking its prey. "We need to evacuate," one of the soldiers barked, his voice taut with panic. "This thing is unstoppable. We've lost half the team already." "And where exactly do you suggest we go?" Elena shot back, her voice sharp. "We're in the middle of nowhere. If he gets out of this facility, there's nothing stopping him from reaching the nearest settlement, or worse." The soldier opened his mouth to argue, but another voice interrupted. "He's heading for the reactor." It was Dr. Singh, a nuclear physicist who had been monitoring the cameras. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he pointed at the screen. "If he breaches the reactor core, the entire facility will go up." Elena felt a cold dread settle over her. The reactor wasn't just the facility's power source, it was a potential bomb. If Daniel's destructive tendencies triggered a meltdown, the resulting explosion would devastate the surrounding area, scattering radioactive fallout across thousands of miles. She turned to the group, her mind racing. "We need to contain him before he gets there. If we can't stop him, we'll have to isolate the reactor." "Are you insane?" Singh hissed. "If we lock down the reactor, we'll be trapped in here with him." "Better us than the rest of the world," she said, her voice hard. Before anyone could argue further, a deafening crash reverberated through the facility. The floor trembled and the red emergency lights flickered violently. Elena glanced at the monitor just in time to see Daniel, or what he had become, tearing through another reinforced door with horrifying ease. His tendrils slashed through steel like paper, and the alien substance exuding from his body corroded everything it touched. "Move!" she shouted, grabbing a rifle from a fallen soldier. She wasn't trained for combat, but at this point, survival was all that mattered. The group split, soldiers taking defensive positions while the remaining scientists scrambled for cover. Elena and Singh moved toward the reactor control room, hoping to initiate the isolation protocol before Daniel could reach it. The hallways felt endless, the sound of destruction growing louder with every step. As they rounded a corner, Elena froze. The walls ahead were coated in a thick organic mass, pulsing gelatinous growths that seemed to spread like a living infection. Tendrils of the material extended across the floor and ceiling, twitching as if aware of their presence. It was as though Daniel's transformation wasn't limited to his body. He was remaking the facility itself, turning it into an extension of his alien biology. "Go around," Singh whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't go through that." But before they could retreat, the mass shifted. Tendrils snapped toward them, coiling and writhing. Elena fired instinctively, the bullets tearing through the organic matter but doing little to slow its advance. Singh screamed as a tendril wrapped around his ankle, dragging him toward the wall. Elena grabbed his arm, pulling with all her strength, but the tendril tightened, slicing through his leg like a blade. "Run!" Singh choked out, blood pooling beneath him. "Just go!" Elena hesitated, her heart pounding, but the sound of approaching footsteps, or something like footsteps, forced her to make a choice. She released Singh's arm and bolted, his screams echoing behind her as the organic mass consumed him. She reached the reactor control room, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Slamming the door shut, she activated the manual lockdown, sealing herself inside. The room was eerily quiet, the hum of the reactor a low, constant background noise. She approached the control panel, her hands shaking as she keyed in the isolation protocol. The screen flashed a warning. "Isolation protocol will seal all exits." "Confirm." Elena hesitated. If she initiated the lockdown, there would be no way out, not for her, not for anyone. But if she didn't, Daniel would reach the reactor, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The decision was made for her. The door behind her buckled, dented inward by a powerful blow. She turned, her heart sinking as she saw the creature forcing its way inside. Daniel's form filled the doorway, his tendrils writhing and his black, featureless eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of the man he had once been. "Elena!" The voice was distorted, layered with alien resonance. "Don't!" Her finger hovered over the button. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She pressed it. The reactor room shuddered as heavy steel barriers descended, locking into place. The creature let out a deafening screech, its tendrils slamming against the walls in a frenzy. Elena backed away, her vision blurring as the room filled with the glow of warning lights. As the barriers sealed, she heard one final, guttural word from the other side. "Run!" And then there was silence. The Arctic wind howled around Dr. Elena Cordova as she trudged through the snow, the distant glow of the facility's ruins casting flickering shadows across the ice. The air tasted of ash and ozone, remnants of the containment breach that had claimed so many lives. Ahead loomed the alien ship, a silent monolith pulsating faintly with light, its organic tendrils snaking across the frozen ground like veins feeding into the earth. It had reactivated, its presence summoning Daniel. No, the thing Daniel had become. Her heart pounded as she approached, the faint hum of the ship vibrating in her bones. She could feel it, a sickening pull deep in her gut, as though the air itself resisted her presence. Her rifle felt impossibly small in her hands, but it was all she had left. Her mind raced, replaying the fragmented memories of Daniel's final words, his last warning, and the fleeting spark of humanity she had seen in his monstrous eyes. She had no plan, just a simple, desperate truth. If the ship and Daniel merged, Earth's survival was no longer a question of if, but when. A sudden movement to her left snapped her focus. The ground trembled as Daniel emerged from the darkness, his towering form illuminated by the ship's eerie glow. He was no longer even remotely human. His body had grown grotesque, his skin a churning mosaic of translucent tissue and bioluminescent patterns. Tendrils unfurled from his back, their ends splitting into jagged, whip-like appendages. His face, a mockery of the man she had once spoken to, was now stretched and featureless, with black, depthless eyes that reflected no light. "Elena," he said, his voice a guttural amalgamation of human and alien tones. "You shouldn't have come." Her breath caught. There was still a shred of him left, buried beneath the horror. "I couldn't let this happen," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I couldn't let you, destroy everything." Daniel tilted his head, an almost curious gesture that sent chills down her spine. "You don't understand. I don't want to destroy. I'm not in control anymore. The ship." He gestured toward the pulsating vessel, his tendrils twitching in rhythm with its glow. "It's calling to me. It needs me to finish what they started." "What does that mean, Daniel?" she shouted, her frustration boiling over. "What are you becoming?" "A weapon," he said simply. "A plague. I was designed to adapt, to consume, to annihilate. Once I merge with the ship, I'll become something this world can't fight." Elena tightened her grip on the rifle, her mind racing. She took a cautious step forward. "Then stop it," she pleaded. "Fight it. If there's any part of you left, any part of the man you used to be, you can stop this." For a moment she thought she saw hesitation, a flicker of conflict in his alien eyes. But then the ground shuddered violently, and the ship let out a low, resonant hum that seemed to pierce her very soul. Daniel's body convulsed, his tendrils lashing out erratically. He let out a deafening roar, a sound that was both human and utterly alien, before turning toward the ship. "I can't," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I'm not strong enough." Elena's heart sank as she watched him take a step toward the ship, its tendrils extending to meet him. The ground beneath her feet cracked, the ice splitting as the ship's energy intensified. She had only seconds to act. She raised the rifle, aiming for the center of his chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But before she could pull the trigger, Daniel turned sharply, his tendrils whipping toward her. One struck the rifle, sending it flying from her hands. Another coiled around her waist, lifting her off the ground. She gasped, struggling against the cold, sinewy appendage as it pulled her closer to his monstrous form. "Don't make me hurt you," he said, his voice strained, trembling with barely contained anguish. "You already are," she shot back, her voice thick with emotion. In a moment of pure instinct, she reached for the small detonator strapped to her belt, the last of the explosives salvaged from the facility. It was meant for the reactor, but now it would serve a far more personal purpose. Her fingers trembled as she armed it, the tiny device humming to life. "If you won't fight it, I will," she said, staring into what remained of his eyes. "You told me to run, Daniel, but there's nowhere left to go." Before he could react, she slammed the detonator against his chest and activated it. The explosion was instant, a blinding flash of light and heat that sent her hurtling backward. She landed hard on the ice, her vision swimming, her ears ringing. Through the haze, she saw Daniel stagger, his body writhing as the alien tissue burned and cracked. He let out a deafening roar, his tendrils flailing wildly as the ship's glow faltered. "Elena!" His voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. He collapsed to his knees, his monstrous form crumbling under the weight of his injuries. "Thank you." The ship shuddered violently, its tendrils retreating as its light began to fade. A deep, resonant groan echoed across the tundra as the organic vessel collapsed in on itself, folding and imploding until nothing remained but a smoking crater. Elena lay motionless, the icy wind biting at her skin. She forced herself to sit up, her body screaming in protest. The air was still now, the unnatural hum of the ship replaced by the quiet whistle of the Arctic wind. In the distance, where the ship had once stood, there was only silence. She staggered to her feet, her gaze falling on the place where Daniel had fallen. There was nothing left of him, no body, no remains, only a faint, bioluminescent shimmer in the snow that faded as she watched. Elena stood there for a long time, her breath visible in the freezing air. She felt no triumph, no relief, only an aching emptiness. The world was safe, but at what cost? She had destroyed the threat, but she had also destroyed a man who had once been a victim, a pawn in a game humanity couldn't even begin to understand. As she turned to leave, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light across the desolate landscape. But even as the sun rose, its warmth felt distant, fleeting. In her heart, Elena knew the truth. This was over. But somewhere in the stars, it had only just begun. The descent onto the Martian surface was as smooth as the mission planners had promised, but Commander Elena Price couldn't shake the unease that coiled in her gut. As the dust cloud from their landing settled, the 5 astronauts gazed out through the viewport of their vessel, Aegis. Mars stretched out before them, a sea of desolation in red and ochre, with jagged peaks and valleys that seemed carved by an ancient fury. "Looks like hell froze over," muttered Ethan Monroe, the youngest of the crew. His voice crackled over the comms, a poor attempt to cut through the oppressive silence. "It's not supposed to be pretty," Elena replied. Her tone was clipped, professional. She had no time for distractions. Not now. "Sophia, prep the rover. Marcus, get the environmental scanner running. We've got a lot to cover before nightfall." The team set to work, their movements precise, almost mechanical. This was what they'd trained for. Every step choreographed, every decision mapped out. Yet something about the barren terrain beyond the viewport felt wrong, even for a place as lifeless as Mars. Within an hour they had disembarked, their boots crunching softly on the iron-rich soil. The mission's initial goal was to survey the planned site for a permanent research station. However, what they found instead halted them in their tracks. A structure jutted out from a nearby ridge, half buried beneath layers of fine reddish dust. Its angular form was unlike the smooth, modular designs of Earth's prefabricated habitats. Time and the planet's abrasive winds had worn it down, but it was unmistakably human in origin. The edges of the team's excitement were dulled by unease. No record of any prior missions building something like this, Dr. Marcus Singh said, his voice a mix of intrigue and disbelief as he scanned the structure with his equipment. Could be Black Ops, suggested Sofia Alvarez, tightening her grip on the tool she carried. The government's been known to keep secrets. Not this big, Elena cut in. This isn't on any of the mission logs. We'll need to investigate. The structure's entrance was half collapsed, forcing Sophia and Ethan to clear a path through the debris. Inside, the airlock mechanism was surprisingly intact, its controls blinking faintly, powered by an ancient, self-sustaining generator. Against her better judgment, Elena decided to press onward. The interior was colder than expected, and the stale, recycled air carried a faint metallic tang. The narrow corridors were lined with rusting machinery and cabinets filled with disorganized supplies. What struck them most was the distinctly human touch. Photos of families pinned to walls, faded letters scrawled in old notebooks, and a child's drawing taped beside what seemed to be a workstation. These people lived here, Marcus murmured, running his gloved fingers over a desk covered in Martian dust. Not just survived, lived, for a long time. They pressed deeper into the outpost, the flicker of their helmet lights revealing more unsettling details. Dried stains marked the floor and walls, dark and crusted. Scratch marks, deep, jagged grooves, raked across metal panels as though something or someone had clawed at them in desperation. In the central chamber, they found the first undeniable sign of something sinister. A large glass case lay shattered on the floor, its contents scattered. At its center was a human skull, etched with delicate grooves that spiraled inward in a maddeningly intricate pattern. The lines glistened faintly under the helmet lights, as though they were carved into the bone with surgical precision. "What the hell is this?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly. Marcus bent closer, his scanner emitting a faint hum. "It's human. But these grooves, they're unnatural. Some kind of post-mortem modification?" "Or a warning," Sophia said grimly, stepping back from the display. Elena straightened, her jaw tightening. "Catalog everything. Take scans, photos, samples. But no touching anything until we know what we're dealing with." As they worked, a low hum began to reverberate through the structure, so faint it was almost imperceptible. At first, they dismissed it as the wind outside or the old machinery still clinging to life. But as the minutes dragged on, the hum grew louder, resonating in their bones. Ethan was the first to speak up. "You hear that? It's like it's coming from everywhere. Could be structural instability, Marcus suggested, though his tone was anything but confident. Or something waking up, Sophia said under her breath, her eyes darting nervously to the walls. The sound grew, a low, pulsing vibration that seemed to echo from the very foundation of the outpost. It was accompanied by a faint whispering, barely audible, like a distant chorus of voices just out of reach. The team exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier excitement now replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Elena finally called it. "That's enough for today. We regroup at the rover and analyze what we've got. Sophia, secure the site. No one comes back here alone." As they made their way out, Ethan lingered for a moment, staring back at the central chamber and the shattered display. The grooves on the skull seemed to shimmer in the flickering light, as though they were alive. He shuddered and hurried after the others, the whispers following him into the cold Martian night. The morning light on Mars brought no comfort. The red sun cast long shadows across the desolate landscape as the team gathered their gear, ready to delve deeper into the mysterious outpost. The strange hum from the previous day had not subsided. If anything, it had grown more pronounced, vibrating faintly beneath their boots. Commander Elena Price led the way, her posture tense, shoulders squared. She hated unknowns, and this mission was rapidly spiraling into a labyrinth of them. The airlock groaned as it cycled, the hiss of depressurization echoing through the silent corridor. Inside, the faint metallic tang remained, joined now by a new unpleasant scent, like decaying organic matter. "Stay close," Elena said, her voice steady but firm. "We move as a unit." The team retraced their steps through the outpost, their helmet lights sweeping across walls marked with spiraling carvings they hadn't noticed the day before. The grooves etched into the metal seemed almost deliberate, their patterns eerily similar to those found on the skull. They pressed onward until they reached the far end of the central chamber, where Sophia Alvarez had uncovered what appeared to be a hidden access panel. "It was jammed yesterday," Sophia said as she crouched to inspect it. "Looks like it's magnetic. Should be able to override it with a power boost." Within minutes she had rigged a bypass. The panel slid open with a low rumble, revealing a steep, spiraling staircase carved directly into the Martian rock. A cold draft blew up from the depths, carrying with it that same sickly sweet smell of decay. "Jesus," muttered Ethan Monroe, covering his nose instinctively despite the helmet's filtration system. "What the hell is down there?" "No choice but to find out," Elena said, gesturing for the team to descend. "Sophia, you're on point. Marcus, watch our 6. One by one they descended the staircase, the walls around them growing smoother, more refined. Unlike the rough-hewn rock of the outpost above, the tunnel below bore signs of advanced engineering. The carvings continued, spiraling endlessly along the walls, their patterns growing more intricate and maddening the deeper they went. After what felt like hours, the staircase ended abruptly, opening into a massive underground cavern. Their lights barely penetrated the vast expanse, revealing towering pillars that seemed to support the cavern's ceiling. Each pillar was adorned with the same spiraling symbols, their grooves glowing faintly with an otherworldly bioluminescence. This wasn't made by the colony, Dr. Marcus Singh whispered, his voice trembling. "This is ancient, older than anything we've seen on Mars." Scattered across the cavern floor were the remnants of the human colony. Rusted machinery, collapsed tents, and skeletons clad in tattered jumpsuits. The sight was both tragic and horrifying, a grim tableau of a community that had met a violent and mysterious end. Ethan approached one of the skeletons cautiously. The remains were desiccated, their bones warped and twisted in unnatural ways. Deep grooves marked the skull, similar to those they had found above. "What happened to them?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. This isn't normal." "It's the parasite," Marcus said, kneeling beside another skeleton. "Look at the bone structure. These people weren't just infected, they were transformed." The words hung heavy in the air. As the team moved deeper into the cavern, they found more unsettling evidence. Equipment that appeared to have been repurposed for biological experiments, jars containing strange, translucent fluids, and fragments of what looked like hybridized organisms, half human, half something else. At the center of the cavern, they discovered the heart of the colony, a large circular chamber enclosed by metallic walls covered in spiraling carvings. In the middle of the room stood a massive cylindrical tank filled with a thick, viscous liquid. Floating inside was a grotesque, partially formed creature, its body a horrific amalgamation of human and alien anatomy. Its eyes were closed, but its chest rose and fell faintly, as if it were in a state of suspended animation. "Is it alive?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like it's dormant," Marcus said, scanning the tank with his handheld device. "But whatever it is, it's evolving rapidly." Suddenly the cavern trembled, a low guttural rumble that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The hum that had been a constant background noise now grew louder, almost deafening. The spiraling carvings on the walls began to glow brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the vibrations. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Now!" As they turned to leave, Ethan stumbled, clutching his arm. I think He didn't finish. His body convulsed violently, and he collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony. The others rushed to his side, but before they could act, something burst from his chest. A small, sinewy creature covered in glistening, chitinous plates. The team scrambled back as the parasite unfurled itself, its many limbs clicking against the ground. It moved unnaturally fast, disappearing into the shadows before they could react. "Elena, what the hell do we do?" Sophia shouted, her voice filled with terror. Elena didn't hesitate. "We seal this place off. Now!" The team retreated up the staircase, dragging Ethan's lifeless body with them. As they ascended, the hum grew louder, the vibrations threatening to collapse the tunnel. When they finally reached the surface, Sophia rigged the access panel to lock permanently, welding it shut with a portable torch. They stood in silence, breathing heavily as they stared at the sealed door. None of them spoke, but the realization was clear. Whatever they had found beneath the surface wasn't finished with them, and it wasn't going to stay dormant for long. The outpost's corridors felt tighter and darker than before. The oppressive hum had not abated since their retreat from the cavern, and the air carried a faint, sickly sweetness that seemed to cling to their suits. Commander Elena Price stood in the central chamber, staring at the sealed access panel leading to the colony below. Despite Sophia's meticulous welding, the vibrations from beneath seemed stronger, almost as though something was testing its cage. "Status," Elena demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Environmental scanners are showing increased seismic activity," Dr. Marcus Singh replied, his fingers dancing across his tablet. "Localized. Whatever's down there, it's moving." "And the sample?" she asked, turning to Marcus, who had insisted on salvaging a fragment of tissue from the shattered cavern machinery before their escape. Marcus hesitated, his usual scientific detachment faltering. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen. The cellular structure is adaptive, almost intelligent. It's repairing itself, even in isolation. This organism, it doesn't just infect, it integrates, assimilates." Ethan's body lay in the outpost's medical bay, wrapped in a tarp. They hadn't dared to remove his suit after the parasite erupted from his chest, and no one had the stomach to examine him further. The memory of his screams and the creature that had burst forth was still too fresh. "Whatever that thing is, it's not staying contained," Sophia said, pacing near the central console. "We need to call Earth. Tell them what we found. Warn them." "And tell them what, exactly?" Marcus snapped. "That we've uncovered an alien organism capable of turning humans into that? Do you think they'll just let us come back without dragging this thing with us?" Before Elena could intervene, the lights flickered, casting the room into intermittent darkness. The hum intensified, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. A metallic groan echoed through the outpost, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving. "Did anyone hear that?" Sophia asked, her voice tight. "I'm not imagining it," said Dr. Leo Carter, the team medic, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm. "Something's here." The team fell silent, their breathing loud in their helmets. Then, from the direction of the medical bay, came a sharp scraping sound. It was deliberate, like claws dragging across metal. "Stay together," Elena ordered, drawing her own weapon. "Sophia, lock down the outpost. Marcus, get that sample into containment." As they approached the medical bay, the lights flickered again, plunging them into darkness before the emergency backups kicked in. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first. Ethan's body was no longer on the examination table. The tarp lay crumpled on the floor, soaked in a dark, viscous fluid. "Oh no," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by a wet, guttural noise that sent a shiver through the team. From the far corner of the room, something moved, a grotesque, shambling figure that had once been Ethan. His body was twisted and warped, his limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. His helmet had cracked open, revealing a face barely recognizable as human. His eyes glowed faintly, the spiraling grooves etched into his flesh, pulsating with a sickly light. "Ethan?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. The thing that had been Ethan turned toward them, its head tilting unnaturally. It let out a low, gurgling growl before lurching forward with terrifying speed. The team scattered, firing their weapons as the creature tore through the room, its movements erratic but horrifyingly fast. "Fall back!" Elena shouted, dragging Leo out of the path of the rampaging monstrosity. Bullets struck its twisted form, but the creature barely reacted, its wounds closing almost as quickly as they were made. Sophia grabbed a plasma torch from her tool belt and ignited it, swinging the flame toward the creature. The fire made it recoil, its distorted flesh bubbling and hissing. Taking advantage of the opening, Elena ordered the team to retreat to the command center. "We can't fight that thing," Sophia panted, slamming the door shut behind them. "Not with what we've got." "It's not just Ethan anymore," Marcus said, his voice grim. "The organism, whatever it is, it's accelerating, adapting." Before they could respond, a loud crash reverberated through the outpost. The vibrations from below had reached a fever pitch, shaking the very foundation of the structure. The sealed access panel to the underground colony buckled, the metal warping under immense pressure. "Oh no," Sophia breathed, backing away as the panel gave way with a deafening screech. From the opening poured a thick black fluid, pulsating with movement. Shapes began to emerge from the viscous mass, human-like figures, their bodies grotesquely altered, their skin marked with the same spiraling patterns. The team froze as one of the creatures stepped forward, its head jerking in unnatural spasms. Its mouth opened, but instead of words, a deep, resonant hum emerged, vibrating through the room and into their bones. "It's communicating," Marcus whispered, his face pale. "It's hunting," Elena corrected, raising her weapon. The creatures surged forward and chaos erupted. Plasma torches and bullets tore through the air as the team fought desperately to hold their ground. Sophia managed to ignite a fuel tank, the explosion incinerating several of the creatures, but damaging the outpost's structural integrity. "We have to get to the rover," Elena shouted over the din. "Now!" As they fled, the hum grew louder, accompanied by a chorus of inhuman screams. The outpost was collapsing around them, the creatures pouring out from the access tunnel like a flood. Marcus, lagging behind, was dragged into the mass, his screams cutting off abruptly. The remaining team members barely made it to the rover, sealing the hatch as the creatures swarmed the vehicle. Through the viewport, they could see the outpost consumed by the alien horde, their glowing spirals lighting up the Martian night like a macabre beacon. Inside the rover, Elena gripped the controls with white-knuckled hands. "We're not going to make it back to Earth unless we destroy that colony," she said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "But how?" Sophia asked, her voice cracking. "They'll overrun us before we even get close." "We'll find a way," Elena said, her jaw set. "We have to." As the rover sped away from the collapsing outpost, the team knew one thing for certain. The entity had awakened, and it wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. The rover sped across the barren expanse of Mars, its engines straining against the weight of the team's collective fear. Inside, Commander Elena Price gripped the controls tightly, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Beside her, Sofia Alvarez worked frantically to stabilize the vehicle's systems, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. In the rear compartment, Dr. Leo Carter stared out the small viewport, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the outpost. It wasn't just the fire from the explosions, it was the alien creatures. They moved like a swarm, an undulating mass of bodies and spiraling lights pouring into the open desert. "They're following us," Leo said, his voice hollow. We can't outrun them forever, Sophia replied, her gaze darting to the proximity scanner. The display was a blur of red blips, each one representing an entity far faster than they should have been. They'll catch up before we even get a chance to think. Elena didn't look away from the horizon, but her voice was calm, commanding. There's one option left. We destroy the colony completely. No half measures. And how exactly do we do that? Sophia snapped, fear fraying the edges of her usually controlled tone. We've got no explosives left, no heavy weaponry, just a rover and what's left of our gear. Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. The reactor. Sophia froze, her fingers hovering above the console. You're talking about the shuttle